This coming Sunday, the Cold Lake First Nations Arrows play the Indigenous NHL Alumni at the Energy Center in Cold Lake. Former NHL stars Reggie Leach, Aaron Asham, and our next guest will play in Cold Lake this coming weekend, Mr. John Chabot. Welcome to CFWE, John.
Jeremy, thanks for having me. And use that word star very, very lightly because you're using the term in the wrong sentence there.
No. I was just checking out your career stats on Wikipedia. I mean, you started out back in 1979 with the Hall Olympics of the QMJHL, making it to the Montreal Canadiens 1983-84. Tell us about getting, the love for hockey back in the day.
Like any Canadian kid, my mom, born and raised and across Canada. My dad was in the forces at the time, and living in Cold Lake, Alberta, actually, where I learned to skate. And on the base, living on Martineau Crescent and 44 Martineau, and on the sand and behind, and up every day, and skating before school, skating after school, and skating after dinner. And I just, from a very young age, through my older brother Paul, introduced me to the sport, and it was just, it's been a love affair ever since.
In your rookie year back in the early 80s, for the Montreal Canadiens, you scored 18 goals and had a total of 43 points. For that time of the era, that was pretty big, eh, John?
It was a good year. I ended up not playing. I think I played 56 games. In fact, I was telling a story to a bunch of kids in Kitigan Zeeby yesterday about perseverance. And I'd sat out, I think, 16 games in a row, and I talked to the GM at the time, who was Serge Savard. He was thinking of sending me down for conditioning, and I didn't really want to go, knowing that there might be an opportunity, a possibility I would never come back, and somebody got hurt, and I got in the lineup, and I never left. I ended up staying and playing the next games. Jacques Lemaire came in as our head coach, and I'm getting a lot of ice time playing with Guy Lafleur and Mike McPhee, and at times, and Guy Lafleur and whoever else. But the Flower was I was his centerman for the majority of the rest of that year, and it was a great experience. Meeting and playing with them, and Larry Robinsons and Bob Gainey and all those guys after their cup years were still dominant players and still great human beings. And I learned a lot my first year just on how to be a hockey player and how to be a human being. It was a great experience.
Recently, you were part of a reality TV series, Hit the Ice, teaching young First Nation hockey players how to play the game. How cool was that, John?
We did it for 6 years, and I think we're going to run a hiatus this year and probably start up again next year. We're not going to film this summer, but it was a good run. I mean, it was an interesting. The producer and I had worked together on another show on APTN called Hockey Goals, and out of that we had a conversation about having a reality show for First Nations kids across Canada, and he just ran with it and wrote it and put it into pen to paper, and went around, asked for funding, and came back 5 years later and asked if I was still interested, and said I was, and we went ahead and filmed the show. And we had a 6-year run, which is a number of years longer than most shows on APTN run, and had a lot of interest. And the funny thing is when I travel the country, and whether it's flight attendants or pilots or people in an airport, I get recognized so much more often as being not a hockey player, but as the coach of the players on Hit the Ice. So it's been a great experience, and we've really enjoyed it. Which we started from not really knowing, there was never been a script. We've very rarely had to do redos. It's just whatever the moment calls for. It's how we react, and the show it's turned out quite well. The only problem is I find, again, as we've talked last night to the kids, is that I swear a little bit too much on it, and it is part of the game at times. Or sometimes I get carried away, and every year I start, okay, I'm not going to swear this year, and then a couple shows in, I'm off and running, which is unfortunate.
Well, you played about, when was your last game, about 17 years ago?
Yeah, my last year pro, I played till 2001 in Europe, in Germany. We played, lost in the semifinals, and I knew midway through the season, and I told people that this was going to be my last year, and ended up going back for half a season the next year and playing just because we went back to Europe to live, because my kids really liked the area that we were in. But I knew that it was a right decision. And yes, it's been 2000. I actually came home on June 6th, 2001. And, that's the last time I played hockey in Europe and lived in Europe. But it was 11 years. It was a great experience. And the NHL was fantastic. But, it's like anything else. It's a job, and you've got to perform. And what Europe gave you is a love for the sport. And when you sign a contract for a year, you're there for a year no matter how you play. So the pressure is off. You can just play the game. And I absolutely enjoyed my time in Europe just as much as I enjoyed my time in the NHL.
You've played with Reggie Leach, Aaron Asham before. I mean, how cool is it getting together with the guys every year and lacing up the skates again?
It is fun. Sporadically, this thing has been organized over the years, and we have a bunch of guys who've played First Nations, Métis, Indigenous guys that we play a game here and a game there. And then they just decided a couple of years ago that we were going to try and organize ourselves into a quasi-team. And in the last year and a half, we've made a distinct effort. We played 9 games as a group. We've got now 15 or 16 guys we can pick from. Cody McCormick just retired. We have Jonathan Cheech, who's leaving the game soon. Ash, 2 years ago he left. Jamie Leach, Brian Trache, Reggie Leach. So we have a bunch of guys we can pick from, old and young. And the nice thing is we've got some young. Tyler Kennedy is a Métis from Sault Ste. Marie, so he plays with us also. And these guys just got out of the game 2 years ago, so their level is still pretty good. And it's an effort from everybody to stay involved, because these guys understand that when we do the community visit, it's not just about the game; it's about the community also, and the giving back in different ways, whether it be through hockey clinics or going to schools and talking to kids, or trying to be role models or create situations for kids to be successful. And the hockey game is a byproduct of what we're trying to do, and it's a fun byproduct, but we want to make sure the kids know there's First Nations, Indigenous, Métis role models out there, ex-NHL players who got to the level. And at the time it wasn't recognized. We want to make sure, if that's a goal that you have, then why not? I mean, you won't be the first, you're not going to be the last, but don't be afraid to strive.
Out of the, 2 or 3 NHL teams you played for, which one really held a special place in your heart?
Different reasons. I mean, Montreal was my first, they drafted me in the second round, my first NHL game. Pittsburgh was of the 3, is probably at the time the least favorite, because we were the 5th sport out of 4 professional teams. I mean, we were behind high school football. That's how unpopular hockey was at the time, and it's completely changed. I played Maryland Muse first year. I got traded there, and the hockey started to change its foothold in that city. It's become now one of the dominant sports. But Detroit, it was great because it had 4 professional sports. So when hockey was over, they're right into baseball, and baseball's over, they're into football and basketball. So you were never the only sport in town, which you find in a lot of Canadian cities, and why a lot of Canadian guys have trouble playing in the cities, is that you're the go-to sport. Everybody knows you and what you're doing. And playing in Detroit was a godsend in the fact that you could play a sport, you could be successful, you could be on the front page of sports section, on front page of the paper, but once the season was over, they were on to something else. And people recognized you, and they were happy to talk to you, but there wasn't that same fanaticism that sometimes goes on with playing in Canada.
John, I'm going to ask you who you're cheering for these days.
I'm cheering for good hockey. I love watching the Oilers play. Less this year, unfortunately. I dislike watching teams that just, unfortunately, Ottawa Senators, who I'm part of their alumni, very often play a 1-4, and for me that was the death of hockey in the 90s, and I would like to see, if possible, the league regulate that right out of the league. I think the game, the way it's being played by the majority of the teams in NHL, which is up-tempo, go, forecheck, 5-man forechecks, playing each zone together as a group and moving the puck quick, is the future of the sport, and it's the only way it's going to sell in different markets. Playing a 1-4 and boring the other teams to death is not going to sell. It never will. It'll work in a Canadian market, but nowhere else. And I think that, so for me, it's just watching a fun game. Watching Pittsburgh go 100 miles an hour, watching the Leafs, use the skill that they have. Those are games that I'll watch and see. If it's not, I'll change the channel. I mean, I have no love for a game that is not going to be played the way it should be. And one thing about the 80s and early 90s, before the trap came in the mid 90s, is it was 7-5 games. There was 6-5 games, and they were the norm, not the I can't think of the word, but they did things that don't happen often. It was always, every night there was a couple games that were just big scoring games, and the fans love it, the players love it. It's fun hockey to play, and it's fun hockey to watch.
Former NHL player John Chabot joining CFWE. This weekend you're going to be traveling to Cold Lake, playing against the Cold Lake First Nation Arrows. You've spent many years in the NHL, and is it kind of refreshing heading to a smaller community and playing some hockey?
It is. It always is. I mean, we've been up in Delaney NWT last year as a group. We were in Watson Lake last year, and we as a group are focusing our time on First Nations, Indigenous communities, smaller communities. The big centers, they get the the Canadians alumni coming in. They get the Leafs alumni. They get the Oilers. It's the small communities that we want to target, mostly because not that they're forgotten, but they deserve as much as anybody else to get a chance to see guys that played and who can still play at a certain level and understand that we're no different than they are. We just had a drive that, and a drive to better our skills to the level that we could play in the NHL. And going to small communities is where hockey is. I mean, hockey is still at its purest form in the small communities because kids are still putting the skates on that are a couple sizes too big and going out in the outside lake and not in the lake outside, or on the rink outside, and they're playing, and you don't get that as much in the cities anymore. And for us, it's very refreshing.
Bring us back to the early 80s and 90s. Tell us a memory that you'll always have with you.
You always remember your first NHL game. Mine was in the Forum, playing against the defending Stanley Cup champ New York Islanders, and skating on the ice. My first skate, of all people, Brian Trottier, who's now playing with. We played together on our Indigenous alumni team. Was the first guy I took faceoffs against, and he was with his big line of him and Bossy and Clark Gillies, and I was playing with Mark Napier and Matt Snaslin for that game, and we had a very good game. But that was a memory that. You have 20,000 fans screaming, and it's just something you don't experience. And Montreal is different than most, where the fans, it's just the passion. And, the early 80s is no different than it is today, except that there's much more press involved today than there was back then. The passion for the game from the fan and the player was no different than 20, 30, 40 years later. And, it was an amazing sport to play. It was much smaller in scale as far as marketing, but it was a fantastic sport, and it was a niche sport at the time. And my first game is something, and I actually scored my first game, my first shot. So, that's something I'll never forget.
Hey, John Chabot, thanks a lot for joining us. It's going to be an awesome weekend in Cold Lake.
We are very much looking forward to coming up. Come on out and see the game, and then afterwards there's going to be an autograph signing at the casino. Before the game, there's going to be a hockey clinic for a couple hours. The guys will be on the ice teaching their skills, and the game itself is going to be hopefully fun because that's what the game is supposed to be.